look, I've had some comments, particularly in the trials. A lot of the markers were like, "Oof, mate, like I can read it." But it's a struggle, and they just say they're not going to give you that luxury of kind of trying to decipher every word. So that was kind of just something I had to do to make up for the fact that my handwriting was pretty cooked. Oh, it was not a fun experience, crafted writing. Seriously, because you just gotta like, there's just so much that they can do going into the endless abyss and void of maths papers because there's just so much content that you just absolutely got to nail.
Hey everyone, it's Johnny from Jeddle. Welcome to another episode here. Today I'm joined by a very special guest. I've got Caleb with us, and Caleb just did exceptionally well in his HSC. He actually got the perfect ATAR, 99.95. He got second in the state in English Advanced with a mark of 99, and he got ninth in the state in English Extension 2. So we are joined by quite a whiz here, quite a genius. Caleb, very privileged to have you join us and grateful for you making time to help everyone watching. Thanks so much for joining and congratulations.
Yeah, thanks very much, Johnny. Look, the privilege is all mine. Yeah, it's a blessing to be here, and I really appreciate it.
Look, let's start with how you felt receiving those results. I mean, there's so many great stats there. What was it like when you actually received your results?
Yeah, look, mate, I think it was just pure elation. I think really is. My family were really happy, which I was extremely happy with, and they would have been proud of me regardless. And that's one of the great things that I've enjoyed during the HSC is that my family didn't it wouldn't have affected their view of me regardless of what I got in the HSC. But they were really really proud, and so yeah, I was just really really overjoyed. I think there was definitely a sense of deep satisfaction, sort of, that all this kind of hard work had sort of paid off. Not having to worry about it anymore was really great because, especially in the week leading up to it, it had been kind of a nervous wait. Oh, what's it going to be? What are the marks going to be? What if it isn't this? What if it is? And yeah, how good that it's kind of over. We don't really have to think about it.
It's a very unique feeling when you finish and when you get the results and when things kind of go to plan or exceed your expectations. That sense of weightlessness and deep satisfaction, as you said, I think is quite profound. And I would be interested to know, though, despite having this very supportive family support system who, we're not going to care whether you got a 99.95 or an asterisk. Maybe they would care at an
Yeah,
asterisk.
absolutely.
But how much pressure did you put on yourself, if any?
Yeah, look, I think I was watching through a couple of the other videos on the Jeddle channel actually, and I think they said a similar thing in terms of I think a lot of the pressure I was kind of put on myself by myself, I think. And look, that probably wasn't healthy all the time because I don't think it's necessarily healthy to put that pressure on for kind of exorbitantly high. Probably takes a bit of a toll throughout the year. But I definitely think, yeah, that pressure was largely put on myself by myself. I'd seen kind of the way that people at my school had done in previous years, and just absolutely in awe at, my goodness, like what an achievement! Like, could that be? Could I do anywhere close to that?
And what did that pressure actually look like? Like, if we think back to a typical day of study or you're getting close to the exams, what was kind of the internal dialogue and what was pushing you to just keep going? What were you kind of saying to yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think for me it was, the knowledge that Year 12 was kind of going to be sort of one last big push, and hopefully, in uni having a little bit more free time as well to, catch up with mates and that kind of thing. I think, yeah, for me it was I'm just going to work my absolute hardest, and I've been given so much. I've been so blessed with, an incredible, amount of school resources, an incredible, lineup of teachers really, and incredible friends who are motivating me. And so I think for me it was, I've been given all this, and so I should make the most of it. And whether or not that looks like a certain ATAR or a certain mark, I'm just going to do my best, and just see what happens and just be thankful with the result.
And this might be a hard one to answer because I could tell you're quite humble, but have you always kind of been at the top, or have you kind of put your head down at a certain point and been like, I want to improve, I want to get better and better?
Yeah, sure, mate. That's a tricky question to answer. I think. I think if I certainly wouldn't say that I'm smarter than than my friends and that kind of thing. My friends are exceptionally smart. I think I've kind of pushed myself to maybe, I don't know, ranking wise is a helpful way to put it. Stay sort of towards the top region. I also don't think that marks and your rank corresponds to how intelligent you are necessarily. I think it's often an indicator of how hard you worked. That's kind of been my experience. but it's not because I'm, intrinsically better than anybody else by any sense of the imagination.
Yeah, and the reason I ask, and sorry to put you on the spot there, because I know no one wants to say, "Oh, yeah, I've always been at the top." I ask because some people go through a journey of kind of putting their head down maybe before year 11, and then they see rapid improvements. Some people actually sustain a high level all the way throughout high school, and that's another interesting perspective. So, just wanted to know where you're at there, because I find it really impressive if you can kind of hold your position year after year. And I'd be interested to know, did that ever kind of wear on you, or was there just a constant sense of like, I need to keep this up, I need to keep getting better?
An interesting note I'll point out actually is that, in year 10 English, I didn't do quite sort of the top of the top. And so I wasn't actually put in the top class necessarily for year 11 and 12, which is interesting. I think I was very lucky and fortunate because I was landed with an exceptional teacher, who it's very unlikely that she'd be watching this, but she was unbelievable. Yeah, so her name's Erin Foster. She's a teacher at Barker. She's unbelievable. And so I was exceptionally lucky there. But yeah, I mean, regardless of where you sit in like the rankings or anything, you've always got to put your head down and work as hard as you can. And it's always a measure of how hard you worked, I think. And so I've always kind of just had to go, all right, Caleb, you got to pull yourself together and work at it, and don't let it wear on you, because other people's opinion of you won't change whether you're at the top or close to the top, or whether you're not at that stage. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And you talk about, hard work being kind of the main ingredient for success, in your experience. What does that actually look like? Like, take us through a typical day of study, maybe start with when you're at school during the term, and then take us to a day where you didn't have school and it's just before your final exams or perhaps trials.
A typical day varied, I think. So I was vice captain, which, meant there was a lot of kind of responsibility there. To do different things. And, there was all these extracurriculars like with music and with sport. So that kind of changed up the schedule. But generally it'd be, if you want to run down at the afternoon schedule, it'd be kind of get home, have a bit of a break, maybe for half an hour or something, and then kind of, get into it. I think for me, my experience was I loved math more than anything in high school. And so math was definitely very, very disproportionately the subject that I worked on the hardest during the terms. So I did extension 2, and that was just a lot, because there's just so much content that you just absolutely got to nail. With my other subjects, so with English and with economics particularly, I also did music, but particularly with English and economics, it was keeping on top of the load, any homework that had been set, on top of the text, on top of the quotes that I was, writing down, and, if I had noticed something, I might extract that for later, to put in an English essay. And so yeah, for me it was during the term keeping on top and being consistent in my workload. But I think towards the exams is the period where I probably stepped on the accelerator, mostly for English and economics, sort of. Particularly in the lead up to exams, it was kind of refining some essays to use. And I know that's a controversial approach, but that was probably my approach, I think.
Well, tell us more about that. What do you mean by refining? And was it memorizing? People would be curious as to what the exact process was there.
For me, what I was encouraged by my teachers to do or encouraged by some teachers more than others actually, but I was encouraged to, kind of craft the best essays I could as like a sort of a base essay, right? A base essay to respond to, all manner of different questions, and to have a diverse enough kind of series of quotes and analysis that you could sort of adjust it and tailor it to a lot of questions. That wouldn't work for every question, but there are certainly, really key themes in each text that the questions kind of can't avoid, sort of. And so I think, having a base essay was really important. Towards the HSC, that looked like, collaborating with my mates and, helping each other figure out what would work best. But during the year, that was also kind of just, working with my teachers to figure out sort of what that best base essay might look like. And then, just practicing adapting that to questions, I think, was definitely a key component. So I think my tactic was definitely have these base essays, sort of learn them, learn them pretty thoroughly, and then practice adapting them to the question, and be prepared to not use significant chunks of them if the question won't allow for it. And that being said, I do want to point out something else though. I don't think that there is a substitute for intimate knowledge of the text, I don't think. And that's what my teacher, Miss Foster, actually was pretty adamant about during the HSC, that more so than memorizing, which can only get you so far, having an intimate knowledge of the text will actually help you more than anything to answer the question really well. Because if all you do is go in with a memorized essay and you get a question that's not going to work with that, then, that's not going to end very well. And so having an intimate knowledge of the text, engaging with it in class, which I really tried to do all throughout the year. I think others could attest to the fact that, I was really engaged in class, particularly in English, in terms of learning the text, really engaged in class, answering questions, asking questions whenever I could, and just being really vocal, which I hope didn't get too annoying for others. But, answering and engaging with the text really helped, in terms of sort of subconsciously getting those quotes under my belt, sort of without having to really sit down and do insanely hard memorizing of quotes, and also just, getting that thematic understanding so that you kind of can subconsciously just get more of an understanding of how you might answer certain questions based on any theme that they present you, sort of.
Yeah,
Hope that's
awesome.
not too convoluted at
No,
all.
no, that's perfect.
Yeah.
I'm digesting it. So I want to go a little bit deeper on that while we're on the topic of English. So aside from kind of having these base essays, getting really familiar with them to the point of essentially having memorized them, but also practicing lots of different questions and making sure you're malleable, flexible, adapting to different things so you don't just repeat that on the day. What are some other key things that you did that really paid off in terms of improving the quality of your responses?
Yeah, look, I think teacher feedback can't be understated. In terms of teacher feedback is ridiculously important. And I had a number of teachers who were extremely generous with their time. And even in, the day before paper one and paper two, as I was sending them essays and, mod C, imaginatives and discursives, like they were still willing to provide feedback and really critically analyze. I think that, on the topic of feedback, it's really important to listen to feedback and to kind of just accept when teachers go, oh, it's just not great. Because that definitely happened. That definitely happened a number of times. And so you just got to reassess and go, okay, it's not great. What am I going to do? I'm not going to get down on myself, but I'm just going to work with their feedback and try and improve it, right? Responding to feedback and being open-minded and listening to it is really important. I think, so, just practicing and adapting to questions is also really important. And I think for me, one of the things that I did in the lead up to the HSC in particular was I kind of went through a lot of past papers, sort of garnered as many practice questions as I could, put them all in a big document, and then just essentially just smashed them all out in terms of planning them. Didn't necessarily write out a full response to all of them, but just kind of just planned, okay, how would I answer this one? Even mentally, just, how would I answer this? What would be the key lines of argument I would use for this one? How would I go about this question? Oh, what if they give me a question on this? What if they give me a question on that? And so really just kind of working with it as diverse a range of questions as possible really prepares you, I think as best as you can for, the HSC, which can be definitely unpredictable at times.
Yeah, that's great advice. And just looking at the essays in particular for a second. So you've got 3 essays you ended up doing, common mod, mod A, mod B. What did the structures look like holistically? How many body paragraphs were in each of those? And how did you think about structuring your arguments in each of those? If you can just kind of go through maybe common mod first, then mod A, then mod B.
Yeah, sure. I don't think there's a one size fits all approach. And what my English teachers have taught me is definitely not the only way to do it. But certainly for me, it was, so I'll go through common mod. So common mod, actually, I can hardly even remember, honestly, but I'll do my best. It's kind of been a big brain dump of information since the HSC. I kind of just offloaded all that, but I think I can do my best. So common mod with 1984, I did, was, an intro, and then 3 paragraphs which kind of track the tripartite structure of the novel. Winston's oppression, Winston's awakening, and Winston's obliteration, I think, is the terms that we use to describe it. And so I had an intro, a few kind of key lines that I would start my essay with for some context, talking a little bit about, some of the key sort of literary thinkers who Orwell had been shaped by and who Orwell, shaped as well. Kind of just is nice for some context and can kind of work with the majority of essays. But then, you kind of leave the rest of your intro sort of blank a little bit to answer those lines of argument that you're going to need to do specifically to the question. And then for me, it was for each part of the text that generally corresponded to my first paragraph, my second paragraph, my third paragraph. Not always, because sometimes you can take it thematically rather than kind of chronologically through the book. And take quotes from all different places for your paragraphs. But I think definitely it's helpful for the logical flow. The earlier parts of your books, the earlier part of your book you mentioned earlier on, the middle part you mentioned in the middle, and the conclusion you mentioned in your conclusion, just to wrap up your line of argument, and just to follow the logical flow that the author is really clearly trying to get at in his book. Yeah, that was kind of my approach for common mod.
Hey, can I ask on the conclusion, like how many sentences did you typically write for a conclusion?
Yeah, look, I think I wrote one or two. I probably could have done a better job at practicing my conclusions, but I think it was kind of a couple of sentences sort of tacked onto the end, just summarizing my argument. And you kind of want to provide a nice new sort of insight as well. You don't want it to just be, here's exactly what I just said again, right? Because that's just really boring. You're not really adding anything. It's kind of a so what now sort of thing. So we've analyzed all this, we've come to this conclusion. So what does this mean? And then provide a kind of just a nice little finishing touch for the markers to just go, oh, that's a nice little touch. That's some sort of relevance to our lives as well, maybe.
I like that. And take us through the Mod A, even just kind of how many body paragraphs, and how did you even just think about structuring that generally?
Oh, Mod A, the joys, far out. So Mod A, obviously 2 texts. For me, it was definitely intro, text 1, text 2, text 1, text 2, little conclusion at the end. Mod A for me was, I think, one of the ones that my base essay helped with the most and that I kind of fell back on the most. Particularly during school, there was definitely, for some reason, a sort of an implicit understanding among my mates and among my teachers that Mod A was kind of the one that you could sort of rote learn and then just adapt, which is probably not always a healthy approach. But to some extent is true. Obviously, these things are kind of, to some extent true, and then to some extent you got to take it with a grain of salt and be willing to answer any question, right? But Mod A was, yeah, definitely, you look at one text by itself. So I did Richard and Richard. So Shakespeare's King Richard III, and then Al Pacino's Looking for Richard. So you kind of look at Shakespeare's text by itself, sort of, and then you look at Pacino as kind of a response to that text. And I think the interesting thing about and then you go back and forth actually again. I think the interesting thing about the HSC question, I can't exactly remember what it was. It's been a little while, but it really kind of wanted you to target that interdependence, I think, of the 2 texts, if I'm remembering correctly. And it really wanted you to show the way that not only Pacino is informed by Shakespeare, so the later text is informed by the earlier, but also the way that like the earlier text is informed by the later, particularly in the way that we understand it today, which I think is actually a really interesting topic, and one that I think the HSC does really well to get people thinking about, and one that even in the HSC I was like, that's actually really interesting to think about. And so more so in the HSC with that sort of interdependence focus, I had to talk a bit more about the way that they were really, really linked. Even in my first paragraph, as I was talking about Shakespeare, I think I still probably reference Pacino a little bit, whereas I probably would have left the Pacino for my second paragraph, in other questions. I think. Do you kind of get what I'm saying?
Yeah. No, it makes sense. Great. So that's the Mod A, 4 body paragraphs in your case. Obviously, there's flexibility. People can do 3 as well, but 3 and 4 tend to be the common ones. And then with Module B, critical study, in your case for advanced, standard students do close study, but very similar. Structurally, how did you think about that?
Yeah, I actually really enjoyed Mod B for some reason. I thought, we looked at T.S. Eliot, and I just thought it was really, really fascinating and really interesting. That's just me kind of nerding out, and nobody really wants to hear that. So I think, for me, it was, we looked at 5 of T.S. Eliot's poems, and I kind of had 3 that I was really, really, really prepared for, and that I had really, really tailored and really wanted to use them. And I had 2 that I was willing to use if necessary, and that I had enough information to go with. If I didn't have to, I just wasn't going to use them, right? And so I kind of invested more time on the text that I was pretty sure that I was going to use, which I think for me was Prufrock, The Hollow Man, and Journey of the Magi. And so for me, that was, you have an introduction, you have some nice context as well. Context can't be understated, the importance of context, I think. Particularly in Mod B, I thought it's just very, very, very context heavy. But yes, you have an intro, and then you do one text, the next text, the next text, your conclusion, and you kind of want to have sort of a nice line of argument that you're developing throughout it, and particularly focusing on the way in which the author is developing that line of argument as he kind of goes through his own personal experience as well. And as all these contextual, cultural factors are influencing the way that he's writing. I think it's really interesting because you just look at a text that's written, sort of in the First World War sort of context. And then you kind of skip forward maybe like 10 years, if I'm remembering my dates correctly.
Yeah, that's right.
10 years to, oh, what's his perspective now? And the ways in which he's kind of almost providing sort of a sober hope and sort of a sober conclusion. And he kind of affirms spiritual redemption in Journey of the Magi, at least sort of implicitly, as kind of the solution to sort of the world's problems in the 20th century, whereas his earlier problems are just so plagued with with uncertainty and just having almost no hope at all. So I think that's kind of one of the things that I found really fascinating. But yeah, you definitely want to have some good material ready to go for that. But I kind of had a few that I majored on, but that was sort of my approach for Mod B. Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. No, thanks for sharing that. And just to clarify as well, what I got from that, you had kind of three core poems that you wanted to use, one paragraph per poem, I assume.
Yeah.
And then you followed them essentially in the chronological order that they were released, because that also kind of traced a narrative in Eliot's life, the author's life, and you kind of watch the themes unravel in that way.
Yeah.
So am I summarizing that those two components correctly?
Yeah, that's definitely right. I think I've seen essay structures in the past that kind of take it thematically. And so you look at one theme and look at what does this text say on this theme? What does the next text say on the same theme? And what about the third text on the same theme? Or even like some people do all five. And so they do maybe like 3 to 5 poems in the one paragraph on the one theme. And they do that maybe 3 times. For me, I think that I'm sure people could absolutely nail that, and I've heard that there are ways in which people have nailed that. For me, that'd just be a little bit more tricky because you can't really go as in depth on each poem about what it's really trying to get at and what the message is. So I think for me, having one poem per paragraph really means you can kind of delve into sort of the intricacies of what each poem is talking about, because they've all got more than meets the eye, I think. And I think that's kind of the interesting thing, particularly with Eliot's poetry, I thought, and I'm sure with so many more of the Mod B texts. So there's just a lot more than meets the eye, and there's just so much richness that can kind of be extracted from them. And so that's why I think having one poem per paragraph was the approach that worked for me. But I'm sure there are ways that you could do it otherwise. And if your teacher out there says do it a different way, then just ignore me, and they have a way better idea of what they're doing than I do. So yeah.
Well, nice to know that the depth-oriented approach does work, where you can just kind of spend a whole paragraph going through a poem and so forth. In terms of the length of your essays and paragraphs in general, obviously something I like to emphasize is everyone has different write-in speeds, and the faster you can write, subject to it being legible and readable, the better. That is an advantage to write faster, because ultimately you have a fixed amount of time, typically 40 minutes in paper 2, 45 minutes in paper 1. But if we just look at you on average having 40 minutes per essay to write, how did you approach timing? And just out of interest as well, again, people should not try and emulate this if you're not as fast a writer and you're not preparing to the same extent, because preparation makes you faster as well. How long were your essays in terms of the time that they took to write, especially when you were just in that drafting phase? Because obviously, you want to factor in time to adapt to the question on the day. And roughly how long were those essays?
Yeah, man, what an action-packed question, and what an action-packed experience it was trying to nail this. It was not fun. So I think that my base essays were about 1,000 words long. And so generally I was probably aiming for about 1,100 to 1,200 words in 40 minutes, which at the start of year 12 was pretty daunting. I was like, gee, there's no way I'm going to be able to do that. But I think you kind of just, as you go along, it kind of just happens if you're just practicing your writing. I think for me, one of the biggest things that was kind of a personal problem was handwriting. My handwriting's not incredible. It's kind of like this weird cursive sort of jumble. And so, look, I've had some comments, particularly in the trials. A lot of the markers were like, "Oof, mate! Like I can read it, but it's a struggle, and they just say they're not going to give you that luxury of kind of trying to decipher every word." And while my handwriting wasn't as bad as others, it definitely was kind of a complicating factor. And so, look, in the HSC, for some reason I distinctly remember in Mod B, in paper 2, and kind of actually from that point on for the rest of my exams, my hand just absolutely just died really, and so I kind of had to make my handwriting like significantly bigger than usual. And so I would take like maybe at times I'd even take like 1.5 lines or like 2 sort of spaces per line that I was sort of writing, just to go, all right, it's not going to be legible if I'm writing really small. So I'm just going to have to write bigger to, make the words look sort of legible, I guess. Just it was a little bit of a munted approach. But yeah, so that was kind of my experience. And so that meant I think I wrote 3 extra writing booklets per question in the HSC, and pretty much filled that up. So, what was I think the first booklet would have been 8 pages, and then each writing booklet an extra 3. So
Wow.
that's like 17 pages per question, which
Now everyone's freaking out.
yeah, so don't worry about that, because that was just my experience of handwriting pretty much. I do think it was a combination of writing a lot, but it was largely handwriting. The fact that it was like exorbitantly high numbers, like nobody should be writing that many booklets with regular handwriting. So that was kind of just something I had to do to make up for the fact that my handwriting was pretty cooked. But clearly it was fine in the end. But I think in the trials, maybe as a more helpful measure, because I think my handwriting was slightly more normal back then. I think I was writing maybe 11, 12, 13 sort of pages. I mean, I would write like 3 or 4 words a line, right? Which is not much. That's kind of a helpful. That's how much I was writing, and so it really was quite big and quite exaggerated. But I do think that there's kind of something to be said about maybe needing to exaggerate a little bit, because at least subconsciously there's got to be something about, you look at a lot of pages and you just, regardless of how many words there are per line, it kind of just subconsciously correlates to more writing, and therefore more depth, more kind of, a more detailed answer to the question. Maybe that's just complete rubbish. I might just be making that up, but maybe there's something to be said there. But yeah, I think my base essays were about 1,000 words. In terms of tailoring it specifically to the question, I allowed maybe 100 to 200 words of like really new stuff, to like make it really, really clear. And then the rest of the base essay, you've obviously got to continually use the terms of the question. Yeah, using the terms of the question, I should say, is like super, super important. And so in your base essay, make sure that you're really, really prepared to use the terms of the question, all throughout, so that they can see that, that you're actually answering the question right. Because answering the question above context, above good analysis, above everything else is obviously the most important thing in HSC English. So yeah, that's also another convoluted response to that question. It's kind of a theme today, but there you go.
No, it makes perfect sense. I think there were some great
Yeah.
insights in that. And the key is that you were allowing room for adaptation on the day. So you'd memorize a base essay that you could write in less than 40 minutes because you were allowing 100 to 200 extra words. So I think that's one key takeaway as well from that, among many of the other things. There is definitely something to be said for the human bias towards more pages being a better response because of the detail. So
Yeah.
I've heard a lot of other people say that even in other subjects, their teachers are telling them, hey, try and write a little bit bigger, take up a few more lines, take up a few more pages, because there is a natural bias towards that being a better response, even if substantively or qualitatively it's not. So why not just play the game of human bias? We're all...
Yeah, exactly right. Just do it. Like it's just why not, right?
Absolutely. So no, thanks for answering that question, because I think a lot of people would have been asking about it. But again, it does depend on how fast you can write. So some of you watching this might only be able to do 700 words for your essay. Some might actually do less. I know people who did even less than that, and they still got an A range mark. So it's possible. You just have to make sure what you're saying is meaningful and concise.
Absolutely. Yeah, and above length, quality is definitely the most important thing. The only thing that length helps with is just having more quality stuff to write. But certainly answering the question and the quality of your response is way more important than the quantity or like the amount of words. So yeah, don't worry about it.
So do you have any other tips for English Advanced in general, or even this would apply for people doing English Standard? If we're looking at, craft of writing, short answers, anything else you want to kind of share with people watching?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, craft of writing. Gee, what a roller coaster. That was, oh, it was not a fun experience, craft of writing. Seriously, because you just gotta like, there's just so much that they can do, and it's the one that is the most prone and the most susceptible to, it can be anything that they ask you to do. And I think that, with craft of writing, there was always going to be the off chance that you would have to throw away everything that you'd memorized and just write one off the fly. For me, I think I got quite fortunate, in terms of I had memorized a reflection for that imaginative a reflection for that discursive, which I could then, I could I could kind of adapt the discursive into a persuasive if needed. Could you kind of just up the modality? There was something else that I memorized, I think. But yeah, I memorized an imaginative, actually two imaginatives because I had one for extension one English as well. But yeah, so I had sort of memorized stuff ready to go that I'd practiced adapting to a number of different prompts. And look, I think that the thing is with Mod C, I think a helpful piece of advice would be memorizing and adapting worked really well. And you've kind of just got to try and find a feasible link to the prompt that works and the markers can clearly see, okay, it's linked. But you kind of, once you found that link, you can find a way to adapt it and change it to be to fit with you. I think I'm not saying to shoehorn your response into absolutely every question, because you don't want to change the parameters of the question to fit your response. That's definitely the opposite of what you should do. You should change your response to fit the parameters of the question. But certainly there's something to be said about having some pre-prepared ones ready to go, just because I just know that as a human, I'm just like almost incapable of writing as good of a response on the fly or made up on the go, as opposed to, writing a really carefully crafted one at home and taking that into the HSC, just because I have, severe limitations as a person, right? And I know there are some freaks out there who are just able to do that and, respect. But that was not, necessarily the case with me, I don't think. And so it helped having some pre-prepared ones ready to go. And finding good links to the questions and to the prompts, and then kind of just going from there really helped. I think in our one it was like the hope that came with anticipation or something, which for some reason just worked really, really well with my pre-prepared imaginative. So I was like, oh sweet, I'll just use that one. If it had been something else, I might have used my discursive. And actually another interesting point I'll say is maybe the metafictive element, I think, is really important. So I would try and write stories and discursives that are metafictive in their content. So stuff that, explores the nature and the impact of writing and authorship and reading. So my Mod C imaginative was about John Bunyan, who was kind of one of the most famous authors sort of in history. He wrote The Pilgrim's Progress. He was a Christian in the 1600s, I think. Forgive me if that's wrong, because that's really embarrassing if I'm wrong there. But again, I've forgotten everything. He was a Christian sort of during the time of the Puritans, and he wrote The Pilgrim's Progress behind bars, and so that was kind of an interesting story that, for me as a Christian, was something that I really enjoyed writing, exploring the ways in which writing can affirm and extend faith, even in kind of the darkest of hours, sort of, and just the impact that that's had on so many generations and centuries since. And then my Mod C discursive was it was kind of a postmodern thing that kind of linked with my extension too, actually. But it was kind of a postmodern discourse on, like, I'm sounding very pretentious here, but like it's kind of a postmodern thing of, like, the power of the reader in oh man, I'm just sounding exactly what my English teacher said. This is really bad. But yeah, but I think it was sort of about when authors, when you find out that, for example, an author in the communist era or something committed sort of this atrocious act, and then later on they became like an anti-communist sort of dissident. How do we reconcile their past with what they've written, and can we still take their writing as sort of legit? It was sort of a bit of implicitly sort of a cancel culture even exploration, and anyway. So I think metafictive is the way I'll conclude that convoluted answer again. Metafictive is really important, but if you've got something else, then that's also okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, so the metafictive thing, I'm so glad you brought that up, because that is definitely a common theme amongst some of the best responses that I've personally seen. So metafictive, write-in about write-in, essentially. So when you're thinking about what you need to write about, say you're doing an imaginative, why don't you write about someone who's trying to write something? So the meta is the two layers of write-in, right? You're write-in, but you're writing about someone else write-in, to kind of clarify that as well. But I think you explained it really well, and that's something that a lot of people can take away. Now, a couple of final things. In terms of study in general, I'm sure everyone's wondering, how much were you studying before the HSC? Like, if you look at a typical day, you've talked a little bit about how you were structuring, school days and what you were looking at, and predominantly maths driven, which
Mm,
I completely relate to. That was the subject that
mm.
I put the most time and effort into as well when I was
Yeah,
doing
yeah.
year 12, and extension 2 just demands that. But how many
Mm.
hours were you doing per day on average in those full days, and how many subjects were you trying to cover, and was there a particular strategy to the order?
Yeah, so I think in the lead up to the HSC, I think I was kind of content with my ability in maths. I'd done so much maths, probably too much maths, and so I was like, okay, for my abilities with maths, I think I'm going to be fine in terms of, I can kind of focus on my other subjects. And so, particularly in the lead up to the HSC, if you ask any of my mates, they'll say that I, did so much English actually. So I spent so much time on English Advanced in the lead up to the HSC, and a lot on English Extension 1, which I'd kind of, shamefully neglected a little bit throughout the year, to be perfectly honest with you, except around exam times. But yeah, I spent so much time in English Advanced just crafting those essays and getting them really good, like tailoring them to, the highest standard that I could. Obviously, I'd done that a little bit earlier throughout the year, but I definitely kind of worked on that a lot more in the lead up to the HSC, just kind of jam packing them with like everything that I could think of, basically. And again, this is such a controversial approach to have like, base essays. And if your teacher says don't do it, then don't do it, right? That's
Don't
just my
worry, you're,
approach.
you're allowed to speak the truth here.
Yeah, 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 sure.
Just we just want to
Um,
know what worked for you.
yeah, yeah. But in terms of kind of amount of study, I think I'll talk a little bit maybe about the actual hours, and then kind of the study life balance sort of is probably something else that needs to be touched on. I think, yeah, amount of hours. Look, I just did as much as I could. I was, I'm a Christian, and so I was actually on like a leadership Christian camp, maybe like a few weeks out from the HSC, which was maybe like a semi-dodgy decision in terms of like it. I didn't really have the opportunity to get much done during that week. I still got a little bit done, but that was kind of helpful as sort of a refresher in terms of refreshing my energy, and kind of giving me a clear focus going into the HSC of, okay, I've kind of had this time to kind of mentally enjoy some actual time, with friends and that kind of thing, and kind of gave me the clarity and the focus I needed to go and kind of power forward for the HSC. I think I just did as much as I could. We had a study camp at my church, which was really good, and so that kind of just meant a really productive environment where I was doing maybe 6 hours during the camp, with some breaks in between to chat with mates and kind of just be mentally refreshed and prepared. And then when I got home, I'd do maybe a few more hours, and then I think, yeah, I just did as much as I could. I don't think there's any one amount of hours that will get you there. You just need to do as much as you can, I think, just for what you need. You need to work with your time productively, I think you got to say, all right, I don't have an unlimited amount of time, so how am I going to plan and structure my time, so that I'm going to be doing that the best way I can? Because you can do 9 hours of study in a day, and it won't actually be that productive sometimes if you're not working on what really needs to be done, or if you're kind of just going into the endless abyss and void of maths papers, which kind of never end, and which sometimes is a bit of a law of diminishing returns. 3 more hours of maths won't dramatically improve your marks, past a certain point, but maybe three more hours of economics or English will. And so, yeah, just be really productive in the way that in the way that you allocate your time. Recognize that you don't have all the time in the world, and it will actually come quicker than you think. But I think, yeah, in terms of amount of hours, I think there's definitely a lot to be said about study sort of life balance. Study was definitely a huge part. I think probably one of the things that was definitely one of the key focuses of my life sort of in year 12 was definitely study, which is maybe good, maybe bad in some aspects. So I think I just tried to make wise choices in the way that I kind of would spend my time. Personally, just like personality wise, I'm not really a huge kind of party goer. I just don't really enjoy that kind of thing, that much. But I would still make conscious efforts to keep up with my friends and to maintain those relationships, because you just don't want to lock yourself in a room all year. It's not going to be good for your mental health, which won't, and that, following on from that will actually, I think, diminish your success in the HSC, just because you've just got to function as a human, right? I think what I would do is I would make sure that all the work that I needed to be done during any one time was done, and then I would, work around that to maybe catch up with friends and that kind of thing. But I think even on weekends, I'd still be, chipping away and working away, but not just locking myself in my room the entire time. Sometimes, when it was needed, particularly around exam times, But definitely you've got to have a good balance. I think an indispensable part of my experience of year 12 is the fact that I'm a Christian, and not everybody shares that, right? But I think that there's definitely a lot to be said about how church remained a huge part of my life, sort of in the HSC. And I think in terms of long run for me, it was arguably a lot more important in my life than study. Just in terms of the way that I kind of have that hierarchy of what's sort of most important in life, I guess. And so, as much as I could, I had these commitments sort of that I would work around, and that I wasn't going to compromise sort of for the HSC. So I would have, I kind of had youth group and Bible study and kids ministry at church, and doing and yeah, going to church with my mates on a Sunday evening. Those were kind of the things that I wasn't really prepared to compromise. And I think that was really helpful. And I think that one thing that is really interesting actually to note is that far from diminishing my marks, and far from being a burden, because you give that time to something else that isn't the HSC. I think that actually what I found is that sort of committing to church and sort of investing in my faith and sort of my relationship with God was actually kind of actually sustained me in a really real sense, and actually gave me the strength that I needed to do the HSC. And I think that there's a lot to be said there about having perspective, and how perspective is such a big motivator and driver in the HSC, that I didn't see the HSC as the be all and end all. And that, I, as a Christian, I believe that Jesus died for me, right? And so that's not going to change. God's love for me isn't going to change based on how I do in the HSC. Neither is my family's love for me going to change based on how I do in the HSC. And I think that was kind of more of a motivator to, just to do my best, and just to give it a red hot crack, right? To not worry about what's going to happen if I don't do as my expectations, if I don't do quite what my expectations are. But just to know that sort of unconditional, I guess sort of my faith and my family sort of were kind of those unconditional things there that the HSC wouldn't affect, and that was kind of a really big motivator and driver for me during the HSC, I think. And that'll vary based on who you are, right? But I think that just speaks a bit to work-life balance, and don't compromise on the things that will actually sustain you during the HSC, right? Because you need to be a human, you need to be a person, and you need to just have time to kind of mentally switch off, so that you can actually switch on even more so during those periods. Yeah, I hope that helps a little bit.
Yeah, it does, and thanks for sharing that. It's nice to know you're a man of faith, and that I think the really important thing you said there is you had that hierarchy of values, and you were clear on that. And I don't think a lot of people think about it. So whether someone's watching, they might not be religious, they might not have that faith, but they still will have implicitly or explicitly a hierarchy of values. There are things you think are important, and the key is that you don't view the HSC and your final marks as the top thing on that hierarchy, because it's just not. So you've got things like family and friends and your health and things like that obviously will sit above how you go in this thing. And as you said, ironically, by positioning the HSC and your marks lower down, and knowing that your faith and family were above that actually helped you go better.
For sure.
Because it's coming from a more abundant frame. Whereas if you think, oh, this is my whole life, you put too much pressure on yourself, and you can't sustain the energy throughout the whole year, because it really is a marathon.
For sure. And I think that, if you have the HSC as the be all and end all, then if you slip up in one area, you're gonna beat yourself up, and you'll just be almost maybe debilitated a little bit, because it'd be, oh man, like I've messed up at the one thing that's sort of important to me, and I think that's just not a healthy approach. Whereas I think that when you have that perspective that the HSC isn't the most important thing, realistically my ATAR will help for a few years, but it's not the only thing that's going to count, right? I think that when you have that, you go, well, if I slip up, then that's kind of okay, right? It might be a bit disappointing, but it's okay. And if I've slipped up maybe in this one exam throughout the year, it means that I can go, that's all right. I'm still going to work my hardest and kind of just do the best in the situation that I'm in, not worrying and putting a ridiculous amount of stress and pressure on the end result. Obviously, stress is kind of unavoidable. And I think it's a helpful thing because it helps you to know that, yeah, the HSC actually is really important, because it for sure is, right? I don't want to understate that the year 12 is very important, but I just don't think it's the most important thing. And so I think having that perspective is really helpful.
Absolutely. Well, look, thank you so much for sharing all of that, Caleb. It's been a great conversation, and I'm glad that you kind of had a unique perspective in terms of, not to say that other people haven't had the kind of religious element, but knowing how important faith is in your life,
Yeah.
and that you're a proud Christian. That's a very respectable thing to share, and I have a lot of admiration for you for that. And also for, of course, your incredible results and work ethic, because I think there's a lot to be said for that.
No, thanks very much, mate. I really do appreciate it. Yeah, it's been a joy being here and chatting. I've loved it. It's been awesome.
Thanks so much, Caleb. So hope everyone watching enjoyed that. If you did, make sure you like, subscribe, comment, the drill, and we'll see you in the next one.